When I started practicing law and working as a lawyer, I immersed myself totally in the things that my clients were involved in and the problems that they had in the situations that they presented in order to figure out a way to tell the judge and to tell the lawyers, particularly the lawyer on the other side, to persuade them that the situation that my client presented required a degree of understanding that had not been brought to cases that they may have held in the past involving non-Aboriginal people. What I was trying to do was without knowing it, to persuade people to approach these cases differently and to understand more about the systemic and background issues that were at play in order to appreciate the circumstances that these individuals presented. That was and is a difficult thing to do, particularly when one comes from a background of training that all lawyers have, in which we are told things and in fact required to hold those things on faith. We are told, for example, about the jury system and the beauties of it and how wonderful it is, and we are required as a result to accept on faith that that system is going to work. We are told about the English common law system and the principles that evolved from the common law, and we are told and required to accept those principles on faith without necessarily understanding why or how those principles developed. And what I was trying to do as a young lawyer working in the field of criminal and civil litigation, and in particular child welfare and criminal law, was I was trying to persuade members of the legal profession, judges and lawyers, that what they had accepted on faith to that point in time was not necessarily correct, and that what they needed to do was to accept other things on faith as well. They needed to accept other things from the perspective that we can't explain totally how and why these things are, just accept that that's the way things are and that they are valid. And that proved to be very difficult. It proved so difficult, in fact, that after about a year of trying that, I decided to quit. I decided to quit being a lawyer, and in fact, I decided to quit being involved in the legal process at all, even in terms of being a politician. I was frustrated. It was my view that the legal system was never going to change, and I was never going to be one involved in changing it, and therefore I felt I was betraying myself, my family, and my community by continuing to remain involved in it. So I decided to quit as being a lawyer. I went to, I remember when I told my wife that, she was not at all surprised because she, of course, had seen the level of frustrations I brought home every day, and she was not happy with the way that it was affecting our lives. But she said, before you make a decision like that, before you do anything, it's important, I think, that you talk to people in our community and ask them, first of all, if that's the right thing to do, and secondly, maybe if there's something that you should be considering. I talked to a number of people, and they all suggested, without exception, they all suggested that I should go and talk to a particular elder, one who had experience with the justice system, and one, in fact, who was well respected as also a traditional man who understood our customs and our teachings, a fellow by the name of Angus Merrick. Angus, at that time, in 1970, that was late 1979, early in 1980, Angus would have been in his 70s. He has since passed away, but at that time was a very wonderful, kind, spiritual fellow. But he had spent all of his working life, since he had stopped working as a farmhand in his 30s or so, he had spent all of the rest of his working life until his 70s working as a court worker in Manitoba, working within the justice system. So he understood the system. He understood what it did, he understood how it did things, and he understood to a certain extent why. So armed with my tobacco and my time, I went to speak to Angus. He took me outside to a teepee that he had in his backyard, and he lit a fire, and we sat there and we talked, and he made tea. We drank lots of tea, and he smoked the tobacco that I gave him, kept rolling it into cigarettes and smoking it while I talked. And I talked all day. And whenever there was a pause and I had run out of things to say, he would sit there quietly and wait until I started again. And by the time I had finished talking and he began talking, it was late in the afternoon. And what he said to me was rather simple, as it turned out, but also very complex. He said, if you don't want to be a lawyer anymore, he said, that's fine. He said, that's your decision to make. And if you're not happy at what you're doing, you shouldn't keep doing what you're doing, because it'll hurt you. So don't do it if you don't want to do it. He said, but the problem, he said, is that you're trying to be a lawyer. He said, you're not trying to be a human being. You can't be a lawyer unless you're a human being first. And what you have to do is you have to try to become a human being first. And what I mean by that, he said, is you have to understand that, that as a human being, he said, your life will last this long. And he picked up a stick that was about that long, the width of his shoulders. And he held that stick up and he said, your life is about that long. And he said, and for this long, he said, you're a young man living in the care of your family. And at that point, he said, when you leave your family, then you have to become an independent man. You have to become an independent person. But that's a hard thing to do, he said. So that's why we get married. Because being independent doesn't necessarily mean that we are alone, but we need that help and we need that comfort of another family. So he said, you will become married and you will have your own family. He said, when you have left your home, it is because you have learned how to be a son, you have learned how to be a nephew, you have learned how to be a grandson, and now you have to learn how to be those things on the other side, he said. And what you're struggling with, he told me, is that you don't yet know how to be a father, you don't yet know how to be an uncle, you don't yet know how to be a grandfather. He said, that's really what your problem is about. He said, if you want to be a good lawyer, you have to learn how to be a good husband, and you have to learn how to be a good father, and you have to learn how to be a good grandfather. You have to learn how to be a good uncle and a good brother to all of the people. He said, your problem is that you're trying to be a good lawyer without trying to be all these other things. And so what you have to work on is you have to work on these other things. If you work on that, he says, you might still go back and become a lawyer. But remember this, he said, that you will be a lawyer for this part of your life. And he said, you may even become a judge. This was back in 1980, he said. You may even become a judge. He said, but you will only be a judge for this much of your life. He said, but for all of this life that you have, you will be an Anishinaabe. And that's what's important, he said, is that you have to learn how to be an Anishinaabe. And then if you are knowing how to be an Anishinaabe, then you will know how to be a husband, and you will know how to be a father, and you will know how to be a grandfather and an uncle and a brother. And if you know all of that, then you might be a good lawyer, he said.